Good evening, friends. On behalf of the Vivekananda Vedanta Society of Chicago, it's a delight to welcome Reverend Dr. Vilius Rudra Dundzila as our guest speaker today at the Home of Harmony. Reverend uses Rudra as his given middle name that he received from his Hindu spiritual teacher, Arvind Vasudeva, and subsequently he also learned from Ma Jaya Sati Bhagavati. Reverend Rudra holds a PhD in comparative literature and German with an emphasis on religious mythological literature. He also holds a doctorate in ministry in spirituality. He has served a series of Unitarian Universalist and United Church of Christ congregations in and around the greater Chicago area. He also served as a minister of the Kaunas, Lithuania. Before serving in a ministerial capacity, Reverend Rudra taught as a professor of humanities and comparative literature at City Colleges of Chicago for 19 years. He's also familiar with the Vivekananda Vedanta Society of Chicago, and as I understand, he signed up for our society as a life membership. So in that sense, we may say that Reverend is a practitioner of the harmony of many faiths. Today at the Home of Harmony, Reverend will speak on the subject Unitarian Universalism, Many Paths, One Church. There will be time for question and answer, so have those ready. And on that note, please join me in welcoming Reverend Rudra to begin his talk.
Om Ramakrishna vidmahe Gadadaraya dhimahi tanodhyana prachodayat. Good afternoon, everybody. As Sravani has introduced, my name is Rudra. My pronouns are he, his, him. And it's sort of interesting to look at the side and see myself on the TV screen, sort of. So I'm going to be talking about Unitarian Universalism. And I wanted to highlight, could you start the slideshow, please? I wanted to highlight this symbol. It comes from our Rockford church. They have a stained glass window. And in the center, there's the flaming chalice, which has become the symbol of Unitarian Universalism in the 20th century, surrounded by the symbols of various different faith traditions, various different religions, including an Om over there in the lower right. It's not a very clear, the glass isn't very clear to figure out the Om symbolism over there. But it sort of encapsulates how Unitarian Universalism is a Western path that comes out of Christianity that incorporates teachings of various different world religious traditions. Oh, that's right. There's a couple of holidays that we recently celebrated that are influential to Unitarian Universalism. So this Wednesday, many Christians celebrated St. Nicholas Day. And as you know from the Christmas carols and whatnot, St. Nicholas is the forerunner to the modern Santa Claus. Why is this important? Yes, that worked. The actual St. Nicholas was a bishop in the early Christian church, Nicholas of Myra. And in the year 325, there was this very large church council, this church convention held in Nicaea in Turkey. And at that convention, the priest Arius was arguing about the nature of Jesus. And he said that Jesus is the Son of God, a creation of God, but that the Son of God is not equal to God, but separate from God. Sort of an argument that Jesus is an avatar of God, and as an avatar is not fully God, but is in a human being. So they had a debate about this, and at one point of that debate, Nicholas lost his cool. He went over to Arius, and he slapped Arius in the face because reason lost the day, so Nicholas unfortunately turned to violence to try to resolve the argument. Unfortunately, many different religions are filled with histories of violent conflicts that happened in the tradition. It's not it's not a good part of Christian history, but what's important about it is that the Unitarian Christians come out of the Arian tradition of understanding of who Jesus is, rather than out of the Trinitarian tradition, which is what became normative Christianity at one point. The second holiday that we very recently celebrated is Thanksgiving Day, and this is a very problematic holiday for Unitarians and Universalists. You all probably know the story of the Mayflower and its landing in 1620 on the shores of Plymouth Rock and establishing this first colony. And then the following year, there's a great Thanksgiving feast with the Native Americans. We all know that story. It's part of the American historical legend. But that's a legend. It's not exactly historically true. Many of those pilgrims who came to the North American continent belonged to a religious sect known as Puritans, and the Puritans rejected the teachings of the Church of England. The Church of England didn't take kindly to that, so they were expelled from England, and so they were looking for refuge someplace else. They eventually decided to come to North America to form this new colony, this New England colony. So they landed over here on the Mayflower in 1620. In that first winter, half of those first original colonists passed away. That following spring, they met with Squanto from the Wampanoag tribe of Native Americans who had already been to England, who already spoke English, and he, together with some of his other Native American friends and tribal members, introduced them to several agricultural techniques that they were not familiar with, such as planting the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. And it's because of this encounter that the first pilgrims were able to survive in the New World and learn to farm and grow food for themselves. That year in 1621, there was a Thanksgiving dinner they didn't call it Thanksgiving, it was just a harvest festival, as many places have harvest festivals, with Native American, the Wampanoag, bringing a number of deer to the festival. There was no turkey at that festival as far as we can tell, and there was a celebration for their first successful year there. So that's what's the actual history of what happened back there. Within a decade, however, those Puritans, those pilgrim colonists, started to persecute the Native Americans, take away their lands, push them off their lands, and the beginning of the American genocide began from that situation in Plymouth Colony. What does that have to do with Unitarians or Universalists, you might be asking yourselves? So the Puritans, when they landed in the New World, in New England, renamed themselves as the Congregationalists. You might have heard the name Congregationalists. And out of the Congregationalists in 1625, the Unitarians evolved. The Unitarians had a split with the Congregationalists in 1825. So we, as Unitarian Universalists, trace our historic religious roots to the Puritans in New England at Plymouth Rock, and we feel a deep sense of remorse of how our religious ancestors behaved towards the Native Americans, and in our current age, we seek restitution and reparations with the Native Americans of this great continent. That is a hard story, hard part of our history. So some historic origins of Unitarian Universalists. We come out of the Protestant Reformation. My screen is stuck. I need to follow my notes a little bit. So, for example, the first Unitarian church was called the Minor Brethren. It was formed in 1565 in the Commonwealth of Poland, Lithuania, in Eastern Europe. A few years later, in 1568, the Unitarian Church was formed in Hungary, Transylvania. In England, Unitarians were formed as a movement in 1673, and they established their first church in 1774. These ideas traveled to the New World, to New England and the American colonies. Harvard College, which is now known as Harvard University, began teaching Unitarian ideas in its theology school in 1724. The first Unitarian church was King's Chapel in Boston, and it converted from the Anglican Church to the Unitarian notions in 1782. And then in Dedham, Massachusetts in 1825, that's considered the official birth of the American Unitarian movement. There's a historic event that we can connect to it. What happened in 1825 was that in the congregation of Dedham, Massachusetts, there was a Unitarian faction and a Congregationalist Trinitarian faction. And the two sides had managed to live side by side in harmony for a number of years, but they couldn't, it wasn't working out. The harmony was falling apart. And so the one side sued the other for the property of the church. And so there was a court decision. And in Dedham, Massachusetts, the Unitarians won the day. The church belonged to the Unitarians, not to the Trinitarians, not to the Congregationalists. So, and after that, that was just the first such battle. After that, there are a number of churches all over New England who went through the same battle between the Unitarians and the Trinitarians in their congregations. And if you travel over New England today, you will see in the town square, there is always a church. Typically, it's a white church with columns. And in some of the towns, it's the first Unitarian church of Cambridge or whatever, and in some of the towns it's going to be the first Congregationalist church of Waltham, Massachusetts. And from the name of that church on the town square, you will know who in the early 1800s won the court battle about who owns the church property. And typically in those towns, 1 or 2 blocks further on, there's going to be the other church, the newer church, which will reflect the other denomination that in that particular town lost the battle. So that's just a historic idiosyncrasy of what goes on in New England with the history of our denominations. The core traditional Unitarian belief can be summarized in 3 words: God is one. It's a rejection of the Trinity, that God exists as 3 people. God is one being. For the Hungarian Unitarian Church, this is very, very important. And in Hungarian, it's Egi az Isten. And if you travel to Hungary or Transylvania, where the Hungarian Unitarian Church is very strong, you will see at the entrances of their church buildings, the way that you identify that this is a Unitarian church is that the entrance of their building, this will be engraved in Hungarian that God is one, Egi az Isten. Just a symbolic note. A more modern definition comes from the mathematician philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. He's a very influential philosopher in a religious theology called process theology. And he said, a Unitarian is a person who believes in at most one God. Let's move on to the Universalist side. The Universalists were a much smaller denomination, and the Universalists were clearly an American phenomenon. There were some origins in England to Universalism, but they developed in the American colonies and the United States. However, there's ancient history for this. In the early Christian church, there's a philosopher, Origen, who was condemned by the church as being a heretic, who insisted that Jesus Christ came to save all of humanity, to bring salvation to every single person, instead of the traditional church teachings about that. Those ideas did not die out easily. They lasted in Christianity until the modern days, and the Universalists picked up on those ideas. The first Universalist church was established in the American colonies in Gloucester, Massachusetts in 1774. And the traditional Universalist belief is all are saved. And this has very similarities to other world religions because, for example, in Hinduism, through lifetimes of reincarnation, we are all destined to attain moksha at some day. Or in Mahayana Buddhism, also through lifetimes of reincarnation, we are all destined to attain nirvana. It's a very similar belief, slightly different steps of how we achieve that. Now, the difference or the emphasis for the Universalists is that we don't need to wait for lifetimes, that this is a possibility in our lifetime, and it should be our core religious striving in our lifetime. So there's a very famous minister, the Reverend Thomas Starr King. He was a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln. And a statue of Thomas Starr King used to stand in the U.S. Senate rotunda because he is also credited with saving California for the Union. Thomas Starr King is credited with preventing California from becoming part of the Confederate States of America and remaining with the United States of America during the Civil War. So he came up with this quip, sort of a joke, but it's got some truth to it. He said that Universalists believe God is too good to damn people, and Unitarians believe they are too good to be damned, period. Moving along in history, some of you might have heard of the Transcendentalists. There were a number of really great and famous authors. In high school, you probably read something by Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was a Transcendentalist. In high school, in the current sophomore curriculum of Illinois high schools, everyone reads Henry David Thoreau Walden. He was a Transcendentalist, so I'm trying to set a historic context for who these people were. These are some of the famous Transcendentalists like George Putnam, Frederick Henry Hedge, Margaret Fuller, who wrote a book on the rights of women. She was an early woman advocating for women's suffrage. Elizabeth Peabody, involved in educational reform and things that came to be early childhood education. Amos Bronson Alcott, also involved in educating public education, that we should have schools for everybody, not just for schools for the rich, for people who have money. His daughter is Louisa May Alcott, who is the author of Little Women and all that series of novels. Some of you might have read Little Women or one of those other books, Joe's Boys and whatnot. Theodore Parker, very famous minister, very much involved in the anti-slavery movement of the United States, and Henry David Thoreau, who I had mentioned. So the reason I mentioned this club, this group of people that met for some, 15 years or so, they started to discover and learn about the religious traditions of the East, Indian religions. They read translations of the Bhagavad Gita and were amazed by them. They read the Lotus Sutra from the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. They read about Sufism, poets like Hafiz and Rumi. Ralph Waldo Emerson has translated a number of Hafiz and Rumi poems from German translations that he got from other parts of the country. But they realized there is more religious truth than just what the Christian Bible teaches, than just what Christianity understands, and that we can draw inspiration from these different religious paths of the world religions. And they also began to see, wait a second, all of these religions seem to be getting at a very similar religious truth that all of humanity shares in different ways. Those were radical ideas back at that time, and some of the Christians were really upset by saying that the Hindus or the Muslims or the Buddhists also had authentic religious ideas that are complementary to the Christian tradition. I went in the wrong direction. A couple of historical tidbits. So some famous Unitarian presidents, John Adams, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, who is the author of the Declaration of Independence. He was officially an Episcopalian, but he attended a Unitarian church. John Quincy Adams, who is John Adams' son, Millard Fillmore, William Taft. These are very famous people who were Unitarian presidents. And the Universalists on their side like to remind us that Abraham Lincoln, who had no official religious affiliation at all, he didn't attend church, but he often shared Universalist teachings, Universalist ideas that he gleaned from his friends Theodore Parker, who I had mentioned, and also Thomas Starr King. Those were two primary influences on him. I keep pressing the wrong button. Okay, now I'm going in the right direction. So from the Transcendentalist Club, these ideas about world religions, some of the next generation of Unitarians and Universalists decided to participate in this project that was envisioned in Chicago in 1863, which we are all very familiar with, the First Parliament of the World's Religions. The primary Unitarian minister who was involved in this was the Reverend Jenkins Lloyd Jones. Now, you have heard of Frank Lloyd Wright, I assume, right? Frank Lloyd Wright, the famous architect, built Unity Temple in Oak Park. His house stands in Oak Park. There's the Roby House in Hyde Park. There's other buildings of his. Jenkins Lloyd Jones was Frank Lloyd Wright's uncle. So, Frank Lloyd Wright was also a Unitarian, by the way. And it's because of the work of Jenkins Lloyd Jones that people like Swami Vivekananda were invited to the United States to come to the Parliament. So it's Unitarians who are credited with bringing these Eastern religious traditions. There was also this guy from the Moody Bible Institute, Dwight Moody, who was also organizing the Parliament. Dwight Moody's intention was to invite these other world religions to teach them the truth about Christianity. Jenkins Lloyd Jones' intention was to bring these people from the other world religions so that Christians could learn and expand their view from the other world religions. Two very different approaches to why we need to have the first parliament of the world's religions. In the 20th century, these ideas evolved into what is called religious humanism, that we can have a religion with ethical values and spiritual inspiration without the notion of a divine being. So similar to Buddhism, which doesn't believe in an ultimate God, or even Jainism, because it's about our moral lives and our interaction with others, which is important to follow, to pursue. We're going to jump ahead in history now. Eventually, the two denominations, the Unitarians and the Universalists, came to a merger some 63 years ago when the American Unitarian Association, which was founded around 1825, merged with the Universalist Church of America, forming the Unitarian Universalist Association. But by that time, that merger had happened. Our youth organizations from both denominations had already merged into one youth organization a decade before that. Both denominations had already developed a joint hymnal, a joint book of worship, well before the merger happened. And we already had a number of shared ministers. If you were a Unitarian minister, you could serve a Universalist church. If you were a Universalist minister, you could be called to serve a Unitarian church. And by the way, both of these denominations claim an American historic first. I don't have a slide about this, but both denominations claim to be the first church in the United States to ordain women to the ministry in about the 1860s, 1870s. The unfortunate side history of that is that neither of those women were able to find jobs as preachers because the congregations still wouldn't accept a woman preacher, but they were able to ordain women to the ministry. So we're going to move ahead to modern Unitarian sensibilities. The Unitarian Universalists, after the merger, developed a set of 7 principles to try to define what is our religious tradition. And this chart explains what those principles are. We believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every single person. Every single individual has value, has rights, has creativity, has contributions to society, with no exceptions. But our world doesn't reflect that religious truth, that religious belief. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relationships, not hierarchical relationships, but relationships of interaction, of discussion, of dialogue, of learning about each other. Acceptance of one another and encouragement of spiritual growth, that there are many different paths to spirituality. One path might work for one person, another path might work for another person, but together, those 2 paths or 3 paths or 4 paths, they share commonalities that bring inspiration to the entire world. A free and responsible search for truth and meaning, not based on dogmas, not based on coercion, not based because one line of scripture says this and therefore we must do that. the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. One of the unique characteristics of the Congregationalists is that the local church, the local community, through democracy, fulfills the will of God through democracy. And so we understand democracy as truly a process of coming to an understanding and finding a ways that we can all govern ourselves together, even though we have disagreements. That's a fundamental belief for Unitarians and Universalists. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. We have declared ourselves to be a just peace church. We are seeking conflict resolution in areas of the world where there is tension, where there is disagreement, like in Israel and Palestine. But that peace is not attainable until there is justice. The two sort of work hand in hand. The two need to be wed together so that people can live in peace, in harmony, through justice. And then finally, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. The Hindu concept for that is, I can very simply say, that's Indra's web. We are all part of Indra's web. There is a movement, or there was a movement, I'll explain this in a moment, for adding an eighth principle. And the eighth principle was to be journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. And there was a struggle of adopting this eighth principle for a variety of reasons. For one, compared to the other principles, they're all short, they're all a few words long, and this is a long, philosophical, maybe almost mathematical sentence. No one could figure out a very simple way of identifying this principle, but in these discussions of how we're going to identify these principles, we came to the conclusion that we need to redefine what those principles are in a newer way. So the new version, this is the new proposed Unitarian Universalist principles, which are meant to be all-encompassing, that at the center of our religious tradition, love is the center of the religious tradition. And love expresses itself in the world in a variety of ways, through equity, through interdependence, through justice, through generosity, through pluralism, through transformation. It's not a state of being, but it is a process of relationship. It is a process of interaction. So these are the new proposed Unitarian Universalist principles. They should be adopted as our official principles in 2024 at our General Convention. There are a variety of affinity groups based on these religious traditions that I mentioned that influence Unitarian Universalism. So, for example, we have a humanist special interest group, a Christian group, a Buddhist group, a pagan group, and I forgot to include this on the slide. There's also a Jewish group. So within Unitarian Universalists, we have practicing humanists and Christians and Buddhists and pagans and Jews. We also have a handful of practicing Hindus. We have practicing Muslims as well. They haven't formed their own special interest groups yet. So Petra Page-Mann, who is the editor of our publication, The UU World, defines Unitarian Universalism this way. Unitarian Universalism beautifully melds all of these world flavors to nourish our minds, bodies, and spirits that we take from these various different traditions in the world for our personal enhancement, but not just to make ourselves better. Here's my definition, how I like to define it. Inspired by a variety of religious and spiritual teachings of the world, Unitarian Universalists, number one, love. Oops, I need to move this. I missed that slide for you. I'm sorry. So Petra's statement is that Unitarian Universalism beautifully melds all of these world flavors to nourish our minds, bodies, and spirits. And here's my definition. Inspired by a variety of religious and spiritual teachings of the world, Unitarian Universalists, number one, love. We love, we learn to love, we hope to love, we strive to love all people, all sentient beings with no exceptions. We grow. we become good ourselves in order to do good, to bring the goodness into the world. That's sort of like the principle of karma yoga. And finally, we serve. We serve to create the common good for all, with no exceptions, with no one excluded. Where are Unitarian and Universalists in the entire world? So in North America, in the United States of America, we're the denomination that's both Unitarian and Universalist. All the other denominations around the world call themselves Unitarians because there wasn't a Universalist movement in those countries. But we have a Unitarian church in the Philippines. We have in India a Unitarian movement. In the Khasi Hills of northern India, we have a Unitarian movement. And in other parts of the world, all over Europe, for example, which is the historic origins of the movement, in Australia, wherever English-speaking settlers traveled, that's where there are Unitarian churches all over the world. But we also have in Central America, we have in Central Africa. Some of the African churches are persecuted by their local governments, like in Uganda. Several of the ministers from Uganda have been imprisoned. Others have escaped and are living in exile, seeking asylum in the United States or in Canada. I wanted to provide a sample covenant. The Unitarian Universalist tradition is a covenantal tradition. We come together as a group of people agreeing to work with each other, but you have to have a principle of how you're going to work together with each other. So a number of covenants were developed to try to define how we're going to work together. This is one of them. This is one of the most famous ones from about the 1930s. And it would be typical for a congregation that uses this particular covenant to begin their worship service by saying this covenant as a reminder of how we interoperate with each other. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve human need, to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God. That sort of summarizes what Unitarian Universalism is about, that we individually practice in our congregations what we seek to be in the world, to learn right relationships with each other and to bring what we have learned in our interactions with each other into the wider world around us, and to help transform that wider world into one of a loving, compassionate, just world of interaction where there is no need, where there is no want, where everyone has the resources, the food, the housing, the education, the clothing, the medical care that they need. And like, for example, now in Chicago, we have all these tent cities with these asylum seekers from Central America. How do we address that issue? How do we help these people establish themselves and return to a normal sense of life after they had to give up everything in their home countries and flee looking for a better way of life in our own country? So that would be an example of a modern Unitarian Universalist concern. So here are some of the historical things that Unitarian Universalists worked on. Karma yoga, basically, social justice concerns. So in the colonial era, we established a large number of Native American schools. And those schools probably did a lot of good in providing education, but those schools were also colonial schools because they taught the Native Americans how to be white, how to be English to the detriment of their own traditional ways, their cultures, and their languages. And this is one of the reasons that we are seeking to find ways of reparation for the Native Americans that we've affected. The Unitarians and Universalists were very strong advocates for the abolition of slavery. We worked very diligently for women's suffrage, the women's right to vote, for the social gospel movement in the early 20th century, which included such things as temperance and workers' rights, union rights, so that as people were flocking to the cities and living in decrepit conditions with unsafe drinking water, unclean food, polluted air, how can we improve their lives to make sure that they had those basic needs of housing and clean food, water? During World War II, we were very heavily involved in saving Jews and children from Nazi persecution. And it was in that era that the Unitarian Service Committee was formed, and they tried to come up with a symbol for it. So they decided to come up with the symbol of the flaming chalice. And the flaming chalice has historic connotations. So first of all, the flaming chalice looks like a Christian, looks like a Christian cross, but it's been replaced by the chalice. In the early Reformation era, Reformed churches used the symbol of a chalice to let people know that this is a Reformed church as opposed to a Catholic church. So we readopted that symbol during World War II, but we added the flame of it, the flame of light, the flame of truth, the flame of love on top of it as a symbol to let people know that this was a safe haven, this was a place of refuge that people can turn to go to seek help to try to get out of Nazi Germany and Nazi-occupied countries and the persecutions under the Nazis. More modern in our current time, these are our social justice or karma yoga concerns. The Unitarian Universalist denomination defines itself as an anti-racist, anti-oppression, multicultural denomination. We seek to strive to address the racism in ourselves and in our congregations and in our societies and eliminate the racism. We seek to address all forms of oppression that exist: economic oppression, educational oppression, physical oppression, and accept multiculturalism, that there are many different cultures in the world. Indian culture, American culture, Brazilian culture, Chinese culture, and all cultures of the world are like a gem, and each facet of the gem reflects a different culture of the world, and they are all equally beautiful and valuable. Other concerns of the modern era is a just world for all. Middle Eastern just peace in the Middle East, and we've been working on that for decades to try to find ways to help the Palestinians and the Israelis to find common ground and peace and harmony between themselves. And we're not the only denomination involved that many. There's a group of churches called Churches for Peace in the Middle East that's involved in these efforts. The civil rights movement of the 1960s, we were standing side by side, a number of our ministers and lay people were standing side by side with Martin Luther King and other leaders of the civil rights era. The Equal Rights Amendment for equal rights for women, the LGBTQ equality movement in the United States, marriage equality. The first cases of marriage equality occurred in Massachusetts when it was four different Unitarian couples sued the state for marriage equality and eventually won that from the Supreme Court of the state of Massachusetts. Black Lives Matter, racial equality to stop the discrimination against African Americans and other historically marginalized and underrepresented groups in our country, including Hispanic Americans, Alaskan Natives, Asian Americans, Native Americans. Currently, we stand for women's reproductive rights, for Native American reparations, and for the democratic process and the protection of the democratic process, because we see a threat coming from the January 6th insurrection to the democratic process. So those are some of the concerns, the social justice concerns that Unitarian Universalists are working on currently. In terms of our religious movement, there's similarities. Just as the way I look at it is that Unitarian Universalists evolved, developed out of Christianity and came to these much broader understandings of religion and spirituality and ethics and justice and what love is like. But if you look at other religious traditions, I have to move this slide too, in addition to my notes slide. Sorry about that. In other parts of the world, so for example, in Islam, the Baha'i movement developed into a much more universal understanding of what religion is and what are the teachings of both the Prophet Muhammad and the Prophet Baha'u'llah to the world about justice and equity for all peoples. In Hinduism, we have Vedanta. Not just with Swami Vivekananda, but centuries earlier, the Vedanta movement began. And then in Mahayana Buddhism also, that there are many different paths to attain what we would call as Christian salvations, what the Hindus would call moksha, what the Buddhists would call nirvana. These developments are happening in the world religions. And also, we should take Guru Nanak and Sikhism as well, which already as its basis incorporates scriptures that come from both Hindu and Muslim traditions and poets and creative peoples. So we see ourselves as a movement not alone in the West in Christianity, but a movement that is a parallel movement to other developments in other parts of the world in religious understanding. And we have some time for questions and answers. There's a microphone coming up.
Unitarians, do you have much of a missionary movement?
Could you explain what you mean by missionary?
Well, I mean, do you send people to other parts of the world hoping to convert them to Unitarianism? Or how do these churches in Africa, how do those in India, how do they arise?
So the churches, so wherever there was British colonialism, wherever there were, colonial enterprises of the British kingdom, there are also Unitarian churches in those parts of the world because it came with the British. Basically, even though the British are officially Anglican, there were also Unitarians who were involved in those areas of the world. So like Sir John Woodruff, who was very interested in Hindu scriptures and the Theosophical Society, also helped to influence Unitarian developments in India, for example. So the Unitarian Universalists in the present age do not send missionaries out to other countries for converting them to our religious tradition. Our Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, supports worldwide relief efforts that deal with women's rights, children's rights, and natural disasters. Those are the three areas of focus for them in different parts of the world, especially in the parts of the world that are impoverished and need assistance. So that would be our modern missionary effort, but it's to help people in need where there is a grave need, where there's grave oppression happening, instead of to help convert them to our way of thinking.
So is there much of a movement even today in England itself?
So yeah, there's a Unitarian church in England. There are I don't know how large it is, where congregations are scattered, but there are Unitarian chapels. They're not allowed to be called churches in England because only Roman Catholic and Anglican religious institutions can have churches legally. Other Protestants have to have chapels, so there's a number of Unitarian chapels across England, yes.
Oh, and what is your relationship with the United Church of Christ? You mentioned that you were a
Yes.
pastor there.
So the Unitarian Universalist Association, or the Unitarians and the Congregationalists, had this divorce a number of centuries ago. I consider myself, Christianity is very important for me. The teachings of Jesus are very important for me. And so I attained dual ministerial standing with the Unitarian Universalist Association and the United Church of Christ. We have joint efforts for education. We have joint religious education programs in between the two churches. So it's not a terribly uncommon thing, but it's not very common either. I'm the only one in the Midwest. There's several handfuls of people like me in New England.
Thank you.
Several Christian denominations were given conscientious objector status during the Second World War. Were the Unitarians one of them? No.
So the Unitarian, so back then it was two churches, the Unitarian, the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America. I can only speak for the American Unitarian Association. So the American Unitarian Association went both ways. It had a hard time making up its mind on the issue of conscientious objector status, but eventually started to grant conscientious objector, or granted that designation to people who were requesting it, but didn't take an official stand on it, but started to take official stands against what was happening in Nazi Germany. So we had this is a development that happened in the 20th century because the American Unitarian Association supported fully participation in World War I, was much more apprehensive about World War II, and by the time the Vietnam War came along, we were in the staunch opposition to the Vietnam War. So our thought, our development changed over the course of that particular century.
Gaza has been in the news. What is the Unitarian Church doing in the Middle East right now? I know what the Quakers are doing. I get their emails all the time.
So in the Middle East specifically, I can only talk to Israel and Palestine.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, the Unitarian Universalist Association is part of the Churches for Peace in the Middle East and has been for a number of decades. And we were working on a number of projects of bringing together Palestinian and Jewish youth to learn about each other's cultures and heritages and religious traditions, so that they could learn about each other as people, to lower that sense of stereotype and misunderstanding between different people. And this has been a long project. I was scheduled to go on one of those trips at one point, and then COVID hit. So, and I was looking forward to go on one of these study trips where we learn about how these projects work. But it didn't happen, and I pray that sometime in the future I'll be able to participate in one of those trips.
No, I mean, I just want to know how many people belong to this. I mean, in the United States.
Yes.
Yeah, roughly. Yeah.
Worldwide, I would have no idea. In the United States, we have about 1,000 congregations and about 200,000 members of those congregations. But when the Pew Research Center does surveys, it comes up with much larger numbers than our membership numbers of people who self-identify as Unitarian Universalists, but don't actually belong to one of our congregations. Okay. So 200,000 people about, and about 1,000 congregations.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, if I may ask a question. So, when you mentioned in your slides the first Parliament of Religions, you're referring to the Chicago Fair in 1893?
Yes.
Because we noticed that in the slide it says 1863, so we were just wondering if it is some other event. It happened in 1893.
That's a typo on my finger's part.
Oh, okay.
Yes, sorry.
All right, just wanted to clarify. And another question is, how is this Unitarian Universalist movement connected with Christianity, mainstream Christianity as we understand? Because your talk title says many paths, one church. So could you just explain?
So historically, Unitarian Universalists developed out of traditional Christianity in the progressive Christian sense, basically. Unitarian Universalists today would consider ourselves mostly a post-Christian denomination, that we have come out of Christianity and we have become a separate religious tradition with our historic roots in Christianity and Judaism, by the way. I believe at one point the Hare Krishnas in India sued in the Supreme Court of India to have them defined as their own separate religious tradition and not part of Hinduism. I don't remember what the argument there was.
Reverend, one question. In today's world, there's such an emphasis on individuality, which at its face is somewhat contradictory to universalism and Unitarianism. I'm just curious how does Universalism and Unitarianism reply to something like that? How do they approach, or what's the perspective on a time when everyone is really stressing individuality and respect my individuality?
So that's something that Unitarian Universalism also struggles with, because we're part of this society, we're part of this culture. You know, people are simply by growing up in the United States, you get this tenet of, you know, the John Wayne, you know, soul hero on a horse or something like that, individuality. And it is our religious tradition that's reminding us that we are not alone. We are part of the interdependent web of all existence with many other people. And what I do in the world has repercussions for other people and other individuals, sort of like the butterfly effect, but in terms of the relationship between people. So we recognize that this is an issue. We don't talk about the concept of sin, but individuality is one of those concepts that tears us apart, and we seek ways of bringing us closer together. It's a religious struggle for all of us, a spiritual struggle for us. And we're clearly coming from a very Western approach to this. And we went through a period ourselves. So one of the aspects of the Transcendentalists was that you could attain salvation by yourself individually. It was the individual, I forget the exact term that they were using back then, but that self-growth movement individually. And they began to lose sight of that connection to other people. They really strongly emphasized that, but that emphasis eventually went away because they realized it became too individualistically focused. In between World War I and World War II, religious humanists were very, very strong about the issue of individualism and the very strange ways that people were, the stock market crash of 1928 or 1929, where people were just struggling for money for themselves to survive, or for the people who had money, how to keep that money. And for us, that was a struggle for, but wait a second, this is not what our religious tradition teaches. Our religious tradition teaches, even if we have nothing, to still share with other people. And I think it's a problem for many Western religious traditions. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time I've had to you, and I look forward to sharing with you downstairs.
Yeah, and on behalf of the Vedanta Society of Chicago, thanks so much, Reverend Rudra, for accepting our invitation and also giving such a lively and educational talk today. And we look forward, actually this is the first time we discussed Universalist and Unitarian concepts. So that was really a first timer, and thank you so much. It's just a beginning, and I hope you'll come back again. And on behalf of the society and also our president, Swami Shatmananda, I would like to give you a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
It has a thank you card, of course, and another, a book which was published, like Many Ways to God, by our society.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome, and we'll meet downstairs. Thanks.